Hi everyone, so today we're going to learn about quantitative versus qualitative research methods. So first, let's actually define both of these research methods. Both are, of course, looking at behavior, but they're very different research methodologies, and depending on what you're studying, one might be a better fit than the other one. So quantitative research is probably the majority of the research that you have read to date. I think that's what we see most of the time in psychology or animal behavior or even neuroscience. Quantitative research methods usually involve that you're counting something so that you're actually producing hard numbers which can be turned into statistics. Quantitative research questions usually look at when, where, how many, and how often a behavior occurs. And like I said, it always results in that you have some data that you can present in your paper at the end. An example of a quantitative research method to study behavior would be, let's suppose you're interested in determining if subjects would make more errors on incongruent versus congruent trials on the Stroop task. A qualitative research method is basically looking at why or how something is really happening. So it's kind of going more into the qualitative aspects of a behavior that can't necessarily be measured. So typically from a qualitative research project, you would have some observations, you would take notes based on what you're seeing and describe the behavior or motivation that you're actually seeing in an individual or even an animal. So that usually results in having just qualitative data that can't necessarily be presented using or analyzed using statistical methods. So that type of data you usually get from doing an interview with somebody, using a focus group, to maybe get to the bottom of a question, looking at reviews, and maybe just purely observing behavior. An example of a qualitative research question would be, what kind of issues do war veterans encounter upon their return from war? So just looking at those two examples that I've given you, you're probably noticing that sometimes there is maybe one way that you can study something and that's the only way. But then, there's also research questions that you could actually tackle and using both methods. I think for the most part, having numbers is something that kind of is more reliable. So if you can, you always want to rely more on quantitative research, but there's certainly situations where we just don't have enough information about a topic yet. So actually qualitative research can be really valuable because it actually helps us determine what we can specifically look at in the future. So sometimes conducting a qualitative research project, such as the one that I gave you an example for, right? We might not even have an idea of what do war veterans, what issues do they encounter. So once you've done the qualitative research project, you would have an idea of what you could measure for your next quantitative research project. So a lot of times we have to start somewhere, and a lot of times we start with qualitative research, and then that leads to quantitative research. So let's kind of try an example of how we can apply this. So let's suppose that you're interested in looking at a research technique that either could be done through qualitative or quantitative research methods. So like I said, sometimes you can actually use either of these methods. So suppose you're interested in how reading and studying new information on an iPad or any other e-reader affects learning and retention. So for that particular example, you could actually use either a qualitative or a quantitative research method to study that question. So to give you an example of a quantitative research question that you might ask, you could say something like, do students who study material on an iPad score better, the same, or worse on a multiple choice test on the studied material? So, for this particular study, you could have two different conditions. You could ask people to read the same passage or maybe a chapter in the book on an iPad, and then another group of students, they could read the same passage but in a traditional textbook format. And then you could give them the same quiz, And then after you've collected several data points, you could actually calculate means based on the iPad condition or the traditional textbook condition. And you could compare those two means and see whether the scores are the same or if maybe the persons that are reading the iPad are doing better or worse. Now, if you wanted to ask this question but conduct a qualitative research project, you might actually ask, what types of distractions do students encounter when reading or studying material on an iPad versus when they're reading a traditional textbook? For that particular study, you could ask students to read a chapter on an iPad or another e-reader and then interview them about the kinds of distractions that they experience, so they can, really walk you through the steps of what happened and explaining, what were the processes. Maybe they could say things like, as I was reading the material on the iPad, I felt really tempted to go on social media or surf the internet, do other things. Or maybe, that it would allow them to actually look up information that they didn't understand using Google. So you would actually get an idea of what to look for. And then you could take that qualitative data and actually in your next quantitative research study, you could use what you have found out from your qualitative research project and incorporate it and actually collect hard data on it. So a lot of times, like I said, right, when we're studying something as new as, what issues do war veterans encounter when they return, or, how does, reading using all these different medias, how does that affect our learning? Those are not really well understood yet because they're so new. And as a result, sometimes actually a qualitative research project can actually be really helpful because it then inspires research that can be done next. All right, this is it for today, and we're going to do an activity in class about this.